Monsters have come to represent the face of our fears and have captured our collective imagination since the beginning of time. Like our fears, they come in all shapes and sizes and meet us in our nightmares. They can be physical manifestations of evil, spectral presences that hold secrets to the past, serve as metaphors that reflect our current anxieties, or they can be used as cautionary tales, the consequence of man's meddling with the natural order. Film has been the perfect medium to bring these myths to life and allowed filmmakers the opportunity to explore the darker corners of our minds and to create the iconic representations that we will forever associate with these movie monsters.
I've been a fan of monster movies since literally as long as I can remember. As a young person, it was the supernatural and the fantastical elements that really drew me in. That said, it's usually not the supernatural horror movies that actually scare me. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure there have been a couple that really did freak me out, but honestly it's hard for me to suspend my disbelief when the monsters aren't real. I mean, let's face it, the likelihood of running into a witch or a zombie or something out in public is not very high. So when we get up to leave the theater, we leave the fear behind like a half-eaten bucket of popcorn. Then there's another kind of fear. The kind of fear that you have when the monsters are real and lurking just below the surface. The kind of fear that plays on our very natural anxieties when it comes to the open ocean or claustrophobia, and probably most importantly, our fear of a gruesome death. On this episode of Movie Monsters, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a subgenre that I'm referring to as terror from below. When it comes to this subgenre, there are plenty of fish in the sea. And like fish, most of them stink. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Sharktopus and Piranhaconda. So I'm kind of just going to focus on the ones that I either find influential or the ones that resonated with me. And these videos take a lot of work, so if you're enjoying it, do me a favor. Just take a second and click the thumbs up button. It really does help the channel out. If you're feeling extra generous and you want to help a starving artist a little bit, head over and check out my Patreon page. It pretty much goes without saying that we cannot talk about this genre without first talking about 1976's Jaws. The legacy of Steven Spielberg's theatrical debut can't be overstated. It's one of the most iconic movies of all time. The techniques that he uses throughout this movie are taught to students in film school and are the textbook examples on how to create and sustain tension throughout a movie. For literally decades, this movie has been scaring folks out of the water and continues to this day. In fact, Pensacola Beach recently hosted a screening of the film where you could watch it from the water. I didn't go, because watching it from the couch is scary enough. And it's also often cited as being the first summer blockbuster, not only changing the way movies were made, but how they're marketed as well. So, as if any of you guys don't know, Jaws takes place in a coastal town known as Amity. There's a rogue, gigantic great white shark on the loose that keeps on eating people, and it's up to 3 men to stop it. The sheriff, a marine biologist, and my favorite character, Quint, the drunken Ahab that has a history with sharks. Jaws is based on a Peter Benchley novel by the same name, and that novel is loosely based on the 1916 New Jersey shark attacks, which is a true story for another time. While the premise is pretty simple, the movie works because it's filled with relatable characters that are experiencing a fairly relatable conflict. The scene where the 3 men are bonding on board the Orca is some of my favorite stuff in the entire thing. The opening sequence in this movie is just so well done. It instantly establishes that the stakes are life or death and that nobody's safe. The actress is totally able to sell just the sheer panic and horror and confusion as she's being attacked by this unseen force. And then there's that scene later on in the movie where all of these beachgoers just have to watch as all their little kids are swimming around in the water and Jaws comes in and just takes one of them out. It really tests this conventional idea about who lives and dies in these movies, and it perfectly captures just the panic and the chaos of this situation. Jaws was the first film to be shot on open water. It was originally slated to be a 65-day shoot and didn't end up wrapping production for 159. Most of the setbacks can be attributed directly to Bruce, the name given to the mechanical shark out of disdain by Spielberg after the thing kept breaking down. Fun fact, Bruce was the name of Spielberg's attorney at the time. Like Lucifer, Bruce actually went by multiple names, including Flaws and the Great White Turd. Yeah, Turns out the thing probably spent more time broken down out of the water than it did actually in the water. This really just meant that Spielberg was going to have to slightly rework his vision and come up with a way of evoking the shark without being able to show the shark. So he devised this technique of using POV shots from Bruce's perspective underwater as he's stalking his victims, which was incredibly effective. See, it lets the audience know something that the characters don't, and that is a perfect way of building suspense. And not only that, but it's just scarier to not see the shark, because what we conjure up in our mind's eye is always going to be scarier than anything that we can actually be shown on screen. Yeah, that looks about as realistic as its amusement park counterpart. So what started out looking like it was going to ultimately be the film's biggest failure ended up being its greatest success. And that is what Bob Ross referred to as a happy accident. Jaws ended up being a massive hit. So the studio took note and they decided they were going to follow it up with several subpar sequels, each one being that much worse than the last, with Jaws 2 being the least offensive of the group. If I'm being honest, I personally have a soft spot for Jaws 2. You see, it was actually filmed in the same town that I grew up in and in the same waters that I used to swim as a kid. Well, at least most of it was. All of the scenes that took place in the town of Amity were shot in Martha's Vineyard, like they were in the first film. But any of the scenes that take place in the water were actually filmed in the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of a small island known as Navarre Beach. The depth of and accessibility to the water, along with the area's warm weather, made Navarre Beach the perfect place to film this sequel. It's a relatively small community now. Back then, it basically wasn't a community at all. See, there was really only one hotel that the cast and crew could have stayed at, and that Holiday Inn happens to be the place where I landed my first job. While I wasn't old enough to have been around during the production, some of my coworkers were, and in some ways Jaws 2 was a local legend. These are the days before the internet, but I distinctly remember some of the older heads bringing in photos and just talking about Jaws 2 as if it was the most exciting thing to ever happen to Navarre Beach, which up to that point, I think it was. Anyways, I've digressed. But it's only because I realized that there's nothing I can say about Jaws 2 that hasn't already been said better. By Jaws. The first time around. To be fair, it does have a couple of moments, like the scene where Jaws eats that helicopter, but a lot of the suspense is diminished simply due to the fact that we've already seen the shark. Plus, without Spielberg behind the wheel directing this thing, the characters suffer a lot. And when you consider those two things together, it really does illustrate what makes this just such an inferior sequel. On the plus side, John Williams was back to compose the score, so at least you know the music's gonna be good. I always feel like this scene is very meta. Like, on one hand, it seems like a dig at the movie Orca, while on the other hand, it could possibly be the inception for the premise of Jaws 3. As I mentioned, I grew up on Navarre Beach, and spent quite a bit of time in the water doing water sports like skiing. I can't think of any scene that did more psychological damage than the scene where Jaws is pursuing the skier. Seriously, anytime I'd wipe out on a kneeboard and I was waiting for the boat to circle back around to pick me up, it immediately came into my head. There was an unwritten rule in the 1980s where the third entry into every horror franchise had to be in 3D for some reason. Which brings us to Jaws 3D, aka Jaws Takes Fucking SeaWorld. Do you realize how far SeaWorld is from the Gulf or the Atlantic? It's a long fucking ways. I just can't figure out what they were going for. Jaws and SeaWorld is not the pitch if you're trying to make a serious follow-up, but if it's supposed to be a comedy, then why isn't it funny? Seriously, the only laughs that I had throughout the film were laughing at how bad the effects are. Why does he look like that? What is that? Oh, and then there's that other just really weird scene where the diver gets swallowed by Jaws and somehow manages to miss every one of his rows of razor-sharp teeth just to all of a sudden like spontaneously combust from inside of his mouth. And remember how I said that the scene from Jaws 2 with the skiers was really scary? I guess the filmmakers caught the memo and they decided that they should do it again, only this time with more people and less scares. Yeah, Jaws 3D stinks. It stinks like Quint's salty, waterlogged balls after 3 days at sea on the Orca. Which brings us to Jaws 4: The Revenge. You know, the one where Ellen Brody has a psychic connection with the shark, so it follows her thousands of miles from the northeast all the way down to the Bahamas so that it can exact revenge on her and her family for, I don't know, killing his homies or his family members or something. It's never really clear. But I do think I've figured out how Jaws ended up in such a landlocked location as SeaWorld. Turns out he can fly. Jaws 4 is the only film in the series that earned a PG-13 rating. And holy shit, man, this movie really does earn that rating. It is super bloody. It's also the first film in the series to introduce us to roaring sharks, psychic characters, and somehow character respawns. Yeah, don't ask me how, but Mario Van Peebles somehow walks away from that shit. Revenge is just a lazy movie, full of bad acting and horrible continuity errors throughout. Jaws was this perfect storm of the right set of wrong circumstances, and it led to a cultural phenomenon. It was lightning in a bottle, and something that was probably never going to be able to be recaptured. So each of these films had a more and more difficult time just being able to justify their own existence. From the moment that we get the reveal of Bruce at the end of the first film, it was guaranteed to be diminishing returns because so much of the success of that film was just the anticipation and the waiting for the reveal of the creature. That was the money shot. And from then, there's really nowhere else to go. The best the studios could hope for is to just kind of replicate scenes that people liked about the first film without understanding what made those scenes work so well in the first place. So ultimately what we're left with is a couple of mediocre shark movies that are standing in the shadow of one of the greatest films of all time. In some ways, maybe it's not fair to compare Jaws to Jaws for the Revenge, but, when they're in the same series, it's kind of hard not to. Alright, well, this seems like a pretty good place to wrap up part 1 of the Terror from Below episode of Movie Monsters. If you guys enjoyed it, please do me a favor. Take just a second to click the thumbs up button, it really helps out. And if you want to check out the follow-ups to this video or any other Influence the Movie Monsters playlist, all you gotta do is subscribe, click the bell, and then cross your fingers that those notifications come through when I do post. Otherwise, you can just check back every couple days, see what's going on, but I really do appreciate you sticking around until the end. Make sure that you stop back by to check out the rest of the Terror from Below episode, which I'll be uploading weekly here over the next couple of weeks. I'm Jeremy, this is Movie Monsters, sweet dreams.